Let's get to some Jets talk. We are less than 48 hours from the official beginning of training camp. And it's been a minute since we've had our pal Mike McIntyre on the program. Mike joins us now to get ready to get things going for hockey season in Winnipeg. Mike, what's good? How are you, my friend?
Hey, Huss. Always good. Best time of the year, I think, for sports. I love September, right? You get MLB stretch drive, NFL kickoff, CFL in full flight, and of course, hockey gets going. And it's a great time of year to be a sports fan or a sports reporter or broadcaster, that's for sure.
No, it is all happening right now. I mean, these few weekends with the NFL getting going. I mean, the Banjo Bowl week for me is always incredible. You got the Banjo Bowl on Saturday. They had that CFL triple header and then the full slate of NFL games. And you know, it also means that hockey season is just about here. Now, players all in town. They went through the media stuff yesterday, got their hair done, and got some nice pictures for the Jumbotron and Balls in the Gang for everything that they'll be doing video-wise over the course of the year. I know there's the dreaded fitness testing that will happen over the course of the next 48 hours, but then we are live with Jets training camp on Thursday. But before we talk about Thursday, I know you've been taking in minicamp. I mean, we don't really spend too much time on it because in a lot of ways, it's just a way for these younger players, in my opinion, to prepare themselves and get ready for what will happen in main camp. But there are a number of new faces and some new names that have been unfamiliar to Winnipeg Jet fans. I mean, take us out to minicamp. I mean, anything sort of stand out for you? Any players that have maybe said to you, Mike, that they're ready to go up against the big boys come Thursday?
Yeah, I think with minicamp, Huss, you're right. I mean, there's a number of guys they signed in the offseason, free agents, Svechnikov, Luke Johnson, Mikey Esamont, Austin Pagansky. These are names that maybe not a lot of fans are familiar with. They're going to be guys that are probably battling for those, 13th forward spots and maybe shuttling back and forth between the farm and the big club kind of all season long. And let's face it, you need those guys, right? You hope you don't have to tap into them too much, but you need some depth because inevitably over what is now going to be an 82-game season, you're going to get injuries and you're going to need call-up. So this was a chance to get some of those new guys acclimatized. I had a great chat yesterday, actually, with both Luke Johnson and Austin Pagansky. Kind of a fun little story, Huss. These guys were teammates. In fact, they were line mates on UND 5 years ago when the Fighting Hawks won the Frozen Four. So these guys played just a couple hours down the highway together in North Dakota. Luke Johnson's actually from Grand Forks, and Austin Pagansky, how's this for a small little hockey story? His parents and Nate Schmidt's parents live on the same street in St. Cloud. These two guys went to the same high school together, and now they're both members of the Winnipeg Jets organization. So I had a good chat with them. I think a lot of eyes, though, at least mine, and I think a lot of other scribes that were down there, were certainly on the big guns, right? The Cole Perfettis, the Billy Heinolas, David Gustafsson, Christian Vesalainen. Let me say this, Huss. I talked to David Gustafsson yesterday. He has looked really, really good. He is a big man, and he's still a young man for sure. This is a guy that was the most valuable player for the Moose last season. Jets fans, didn't get to see a whole lot of him. He played a few games, spent some time on the taxi squad. To me, and when we get going here on training camp this week, David Gustafsson is the guy that has the biggest chance. And I'd throw Christian Vesalainen into that mix as well, because as we know, there was some turnover this summer. The entire fourth line is gone, right? The Dirty 30s, Perreault, Lewis, Thompson, and of course, Mason Appleton's now in Seattle. There are some jobs to be won on that fourth line and perhaps, as a third line winger with Kopp and Lowry. And I would put Gustafsson and Vesalainen certainly on the top of the list of guys that are going to be fighting for those jobs. And they both, to me, looked really good, especially Gustafsson. Again, you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt, who they're out there with. It's not the elite of the NHL. That'll happen starting Thursday. But David Gustafsson looks to me like a guy who's ready to grab a job, whether it's the fourth line center or perhaps he shifts to the wing. As he said yesterday, he's willing to play anywhere in the lineup if it means getting in the lineup.
Yeah, and as we transition to the main camp, there's a number of stories, and we'll talk about Pierre-Luc Dubois quite a bit, I'm sure. But unlike the defense that seems pretty set,
Yeah.
it's almost a reversal from what's happened in the last few years. More unsure of what the defense was, but having a pretty good idea about, maybe too many guys for not enough spots up front. Completely reversed this year, Mike. And when we get going with Thursday, I mean, everyone's going to be watching the Scheifele's and Ehlers and Wheeler just to see how they're doing as they kind of get into the preseason. But I think from day one of camp, the competition amongst the likes of Vesalainen, Toninato, Jansen Harkins, David Gustafson, Riley Nash for the spot alongside presumably Lowry and Kopp, and a starting spot on line number 4,
Right.
to me is the most interesting part of this training camp, because to be honest, ever since those trades were made and Paul Stastny was re-signed, I mean, we've talked a lot about the excitement of the upcoming season, but there hasn't really been any big issues with the team.
No.
Now, I'm not sure as this is much an issue, but it's still very much up in the air as to how that all shakes out.
Yeah, you just identified. I think there's four forward jobs that are up for grabs, right? Like, it's pretty clear who the top 8 are in the forwards for the Jets, and I would argue it's also pretty clear who the top 6 defense are. Paul Maurice last week, he talked to us just when development or minicamp got underway. He didn't name the names, but he actually flat out said, I know the 6 guys in my head that are going to be on my blue line. He wouldn't tell us who's going to play with who, but I think we all know who those 6 guys are, right? I mean, DeMello, Stanley, Pionk, Brendan Dillon, Josh Morrissey, and Nate Schmidt. And you got Nate Beaulieu, who we're told is 100% ready to go. Is he the 7th defenseman? Obviously, Sami Niku's no longer part of the organization. And if Beaulieu's there, I mean, I know Ville Heinola fans aren't going to like to hear that, but the fact is, if Ville Heinola is going to just be the 7th defenseman on the Jets, he's better off, at least to start the year, being the number 1 defenseman on the Manitoba Moose, who are also playing a full season this year, right? So I think that's the most likely scenario. Dylan Samberg's going to be there as well. And how I set this mini camp, I will say it jumped out to me. I mean, I mentioned Vesalainen and Gustafson and Perfetti. There's some really nice, obviously, forward guys in the pipeline. The depth of the Jets' blue line, though, now, and not just at the NHL level, but the waiting in the wings level, is mighty impressive. From Heinola, Samberg, Johnny Kovacevic, who looks like a guy that very much could be an NHL player one day. And I'd add Declan Chisholm into that mix as well. And Leon Gavante, who fans are going to get to watch play for Germany at the Olympics, setting up Leon Draisaitl for one-timers on the German power play. Like, the Jets have a lot of really interesting pieces, big but mobile puck-moving guys on their back end now. And that's a position which once was a weakness just a few years ago, appears to now be a real strength in this organization.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. And I brought this up over the course of the past week because it does seem to me, and it's a strange conversation to have when we talk about the Winnipeg Jets on all of our conversations about the blue line for the last couple of years. But you're exactly right. And when Paul Maurice says he knows who the 6 guys are, I don't think you need to be a brain surgeon to figure out that Logan Stanley and the 5 guys that are signed for a minimum of 3 years are that group. How much of a challenge is it for the organization to keep spirits up, motivation up, and chins up for players like Ville Heinola and Dylan Samberg, who, to be honest, were they in other organizations, would have a much, much better chance of cracking an NHL lineup at some point, especially early this season?
Right. Well, I would agree, Huss, but I would say the Logan Stanley story should almost serve as a motivator for those guys, right? Logan Stanley is a guy that came into camp last year, was on nobody's radar to actually make the Jets. He was an afterthought.
He wasn't even in the first group the first day, if you go back. Remember those groups? Stanley was in group 2, which is never a good sign.
Exactly. So my point being, things can change in a hurry, and they can change because of 2 factors. One would be injury, and we know, I mean, no team gets through a full NHL season with the same 6 defensemen, right? You're going to need a lot more than 6 guys. And we saw last year, Tucker Poolman went down the first game. Dylan DeMello wasn't available for the first few games. Like, the Jets defense suddenly took a real turn. And we've seen that time after time. So if I'm a Heinola or a Samberg or whatever, I'm not getting too down. And I'm certainly not coming to training camp hanging my head thinking, woe is me. I don't even have an opening here, because that can change in a hurry. And the other thing would be performance, both on the negative side that, a guy plays his way out of a job, or on the positive side, like what Logan Stanley did last year in camp and earlier in the year. He basically forced his way into the lineup. So I would think, although I'm sure it's a bit discouraging, these guys, being pro athletes, should almost use this as an extra motivator, because they know their time is coming, and they're probably not going to have to wait a whole long time here to get an opportunity. They just better be ready when opportunity comes knocking.
Mike McIntyre, the Winnipeg Free Press, getting us ready for Winnipeg Jets training camp, which begins Thursday here on Winnipeg Sports Talk Daily. Mike, as far as the forwards go, I mean, we sort of laid out the battle when it comes to that spot with Lowry and Appleton, as well as the fourth line. The other wild card in all of this is Cole Perfetti.
Yeah.
And, Perfetti, and I'm sure most people know this, but, in a normal year, Perfetti would have two options. You play in the National Hockey League, or you go back to the Ontario Hockey League. I don't think that there's much to gain at all for Cole Perfetti back in the OHL, considering the season he had last year in the American League, the World Juniors, playing in the World Championships. If they had not made the rule change, I think there's a very good chance that Perfetti's on the Jets this year, but, a guy that probably doesn't play a ton, is in and out of the lineup, spends a lot of bag skates after practice and a lot of time eating popcorn in the press box. I don't think that's the plan for the organization. That would be kind of a best of a worst case scenario, right, given those two. The fact that the AHL option is there, I think, makes it almost a no-brainer that he spends a good portion of the time here. That being said, Mike, with injury comes opportunity. There's always the potential that he could be a guy that comes up and actually plays a role more suited to what I think they envision him as an NHLer, and that is more of a top six guy as opposed to a guy playing 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 minutes on a fourth line. But I know he said he came in, his goal is to make the Winnipeg Jets. He had a very impressive year last year. What do you make of Perfetti's situation and realistic possibility of making a dent in the NHL lineup this year?
Right. We talked about Lowry and Kopp and that third line right wing spot. And of course, we're assuming that the top six is some combination of Scheifele, Connor, Ehlers, Dubois, Stastny, and Wheeler. And I think that's a pretty safe bet that the top two lines are going to be some combination of those six skaters. Andrew Kopp, sure, he could force his way into that top six, and we saw that at times last year. Could Andrew Kopp be in the top six and maybe a guy like Stastny moves down with Lowry? I guess that's possible. But to me, the prime spot that if you're a young player right now in the Jets, whether it's Cole Perfetti, Christian Vesalainen, Jansen Harkins, the spot I'm eyeing in training camp, Huss, is that third line winger spot with Lowry and Kopp. We've seen players, Mason Appleton being the most recent, but Jack Roslovic was in that spot. Brandon Tanev was in that spot. Guys who go to that spot and prove that they can hang with the likes of Kopp and Lowry, they do really, really well, right? And I'm intrigued by who gets the first crack at that. And to go back to your point about Cole Perfetti, if I had a wish list for preseason and these 6 preseason games, I'd love to just see what Cole Perfetti on the wing with Lowry and Kopp for one game would look like. And I'd say the same thing about Christian Vesalainen. I'd like to see him get a look at that spot. I suspect we might see Riley Nash get a look in that spot as well. That would take on, to me, much more of a checking role. Riley Nash is not a point-producing offensive guy. And it all depends on what Paul Maurice wants to do, I guess, with that spot. But I will say, Cole Perfetti could absolutely force his way into this conversation. And yeah, I don't think the Jets want him sitting in the press box, as you say, eating popcorn as the 13th guy. But again, if there's a wide open competition for as many as 4 forward spots, I think Cole Perfetti comes to training camp here this week with a chance to win one of those 4 starting spots in the top 12 And it's just a question of where that might be and who he might gel best with. And maybe it's coming in on the wing, playing with a couple of real responsible guys like Kopp and Lowry that gets that door kicked open. We shall see.
BA in chat makes a good point. There's no Mark Scheifele for game number 1 of the season.
Right.
Might Perfetti get a spot even higher, like essentially in the top 6 for game number 1 of the season, considering 55 will be unavailable until game 2 of 82?
Yeah, so to me, that's where Andrew Kopp probably jumps into the top 6 for game 1. And you're probably looking at your top 2 centers for game 1 being Pierre-Luc Dubois and Paul Stastny. That's just my guess. I guess Andrew Kopp could center a line. We've seen him play center, but you're probably seeing Stastny and Dubois, and then Kopp moves up into the top 6 for one night only. However, Paul Maurice may actually prefer to just get his other line set, and whoever Lowry and Kopp he feels is a good fit with, maybe he doesn't want to mess with that. Maybe they're on the road to start. Maybe he wants that line set up a certain way. So there are options for sure. But yeah, I mean, the door is going to open to that individual's point. The door will open for a roster spot, at least for one night only, that wouldn't otherwise be available because Mark Scheifele is going to be MIA for that first game.
Now, it's funny you brought up Dubois because I think Dubois might have more attention on him at training camp than maybe any other player because of the way things went and didn't go well for him after the trade last season. And never mind training camp, going into game number 1 of the season without Mark Scheifele, he'll be out there wearing a new number. But I think I don't want to say there's going to be unrealistic pressure on Dubois, but people are going to be wanting to see a better player and results right out of the gate. And the fact that Scheifele's not going to be there in game number 1, I think it'll mean even more for Dubois to maybe get off to a good start, even if it's just one game when the Jets drop the puck on the 2021-22 season.
Yeah, to Pierre-Luc Dubois' credit, he's saying all the right things here in as we head into camp. He's done a couple of interviews so far where he's made comments about, the obvious difficulties of last year and just never feeling comfortable after coming over in that trade. Of course, he had the quarantine and then he got injured a couple times. And it was just a real strange year, right? Lots of stops and starts for him. He's had an entire summer now to train, and, Pierre-Luc Dubois said he's skated more this summer than he ever has before. He said he feels like he's got sort of a new lease on life. He's coming in with a clean slate. All of that is great. Ultimately, though, you got to walk the walk, right? Like, nobody wants to just hear the talk. And there is going to be increased pressure on Pierre-Luc Dubois because I think, we all know where a team, especially a team that is supposed to contend, they need to have some real strength up the middle. And the kind of performance we saw more nights than not from Pierre-Luc Dubois last season, that's not going to cut it for a guy who, frankly, there's a lot bigger expectations are. And when you're trading a Patrick Laine and throwing in a Jack Roslovic, that's bringing some mighty big shoes to fill, right? So, let's give him a pass, I guess, for last season because of all the uniqueness to it. And let's hope he does come in here and he can back up the things that he's been saying in the offseason with a real strong start to the season. He's a guy that desperately needs it. And the Jets certainly could use that from a player that they're certainly counting on for significant contributions.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's sort of like, a buddy kind of meeting up with you mid-round of golf. And he's starting on like the 11th tee and shanks one into the bush. You'll give him the mulligan. But now you're playing going forward. There's only one per round. So they're now getting to the first tee box. They've had a nice warm up. They're ready to go. We'll see how this next round goes with the Winnipeg Jets for Pierre-Luc Dubois. Captain Blake Wheeler, always a topic of conversation around here. I mean, a huge part of the team. Many people thought that, he wasn't up to snuff last year. He was hurt for a while, and then you look, he had almost a point a game, although very effective on the power play. Here's my question for you. With Ehlers' growth into a star in the National Hockey League, How do you see the right wing position starting off at the beginning of the year, as well as Ehlers' spot on the power play? Is there room for both of those guys on PP1? Because it would seem to behoove the Winnipeg Jets to get 27 out there as much as they can, considering how productive he's been and the player that he's turned into.
Well, in my eyes, Huss, whatever line Nikolai Ehlers is on, that's your top line. I mean, full stop, right? Like, Nikolai Ehlers is your best right winger. And to me, it's not even really close anymore. He is the guy. And I think a lot of the offense needs to be built around Nikolai Ehlers. And I think he's proven that he's absolutely up for that task. He's a guy who wants more responsibility and who can now excel when the stakes are high, right? He used to be a guy, he had the knack that, disappeared when the playoffs began. I think the last 2 seasons, he's kind of silenced any of those critics who thought that, he disappears when the games get biggest. He's proven to be a big game performer, and he's a guy who's coming into camp here, and I think he's going to be given a lot more responsibility. As for the power play, I'd say the same thing. Whatever power play unit Nikolai Ehlers is on, that should be your number one power play. But as we know around here, traditionally, he's been on what is referred to as the second group, aka the group that doesn't have Scheifele in the past, didn't have Laine, Blake Wheeler feeding passes. And frustrating to many is the fact that second unit with Ehlers would often only get out for maybe 30 seconds. They'd maybe get a chance for one rush. And usually it was Ehlers dazzling with a zone entry, which he's so smooth at. But then time would quickly run out. I think we did see, though, a change towards the end of last season, Huss. And this was Paul Maurice, I think, showing that he can maybe adjust and he's not quite as stubborn as he has been in the past. They were starting the Ehlers power play at times. Like, that became the de facto number one unit, even though it was still the same personnel. But Paul Maurice recognized what he had in a red-hot Ehlers and began to tap into that a bit more. So that is going to be another storyline to watch for sure. Does he shuffle the troops, if you will, on the top power play unit and get Ehlers on there? And if he doesn't, does Nikolai Ehlers get more opportunity on the so-called second unit? And I think it would behoove Paul Maurice one way or the other to find a way to work Nikolai Ehlers more into the mix.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, speaking specifically to the power plays, because in the second half of last season, you're exactly right. Even if the PP1 guys were going out first, they weren't staying out for a minute and a half or a minute 40 like it happened routinely in the past. I mean, it really was more. And you know what? If things didn't go in the first 45 seconds, they would switch them up sometimes even earlier. And again, depending on, I think, who was last on the ice often and just who was freshest, that was who they were starting. So, but I am fascinated to see how that works. And hey, speaking of the power play, while we're at it, we know who the defensemen are going to be, and we've got a pretty good idea about how the defense pairings are going to shake out. The one thing that we don't know is who are going to be the point men on the first couple power play units. And the fact that Nate Schmidt is all of a sudden in the mix, and I mean, I think you could absolutely make an argument that Neil Pionk was the most effective Jet defenseman on the power play last year. Josh Morrissey's been a mainstay of that, often on the top unit. Do you think that there'll be legitimate competition for those spots, Mike? And, just spitballing before we get to training camp, how do you see that playing out over the next few weeks before things get going for real?
For sure, Huss. That's a great question, and one that I'll be watching closely, because you basically have 3 defensemen in, as you mentioned, Pionk, Schmidt, and Morrissey. And if the Jets deploy the 4-1 kind of setup that they have on their power play usually, that only leaves 2 spots for a defenseman. So the question to me is, do the Jets bump either one of Morrissey or Pionk in favor of Schmidt and move one of those guys off a power play unit? Or do they change the way they set their power play up? And do they go with 2 defensemen, maybe on the second unit? And I do wonder, to me, I think Josh Morrissey and Nate Schmidt are probably the pairing we see, at least to start, on 5-on-5. And it's probably Dylan and Pionk is probably your second pair. maybe that doesn't happen. But if that's the case, I do wonder if Neil Pionk stays with PP1. And then maybe do you go with Morrissey and Schmidt on the second unit? Don't forget, Matthew Perreault was one of the fixtures on the second power play unit last year. He's gone. So I suppose you could stick with the same personnel that you had, which would be, I guess, Dubois, Kopp, and Ehlers, and go with two defensemen. And then that would leave, Wheeler, Scheifele, Connor, and Stasny, which traditionally was the top power play unit. So maybe you go 4 forwards, 1D on the top unit, 3 forwards, 2D on the second unit, just to try and get all those guys in the mix. But yeah, that's a great question, and something that we'll have to get sorted out here. And unlike last year, Huss, the good news is they got 6 preseason games, right? Last year there were no exhibition games, and you kind of jumped in with both feet right into the fire off the hop. They've got some time to work these things out, and that'll be one of the storylines to keep an eye on for sure.
Mike, before we go, not much to talk about on the starting goaltender other than maybe a guess on an over-under as to how many games that he plays this season. But he won't play 82, and someone else has to make up those other starts, and it's Eric Comrie. And I will say this, I mean, I've been pretty clear. I think that, he's played 5 games for the Winnipeg Jets. A few of them were, pretty underwhelming performances by the guys in front of him. And I don't think we should judge Eric Comrie on 5 games with the Winnipeg Jets. He's had a great AHL career. But all that being said, he's far from proven at this level. How important is it for Eric Comrie that he have a great camp, strong performances in the preseason, and sort of before we even get to the regular season, reassure Paul Maurice, Kevin Cheveldayoff, and the Winnipeg Jets that he is up for the challenge of being a number 2 for Connor Hellebuyck for a full NHL year?
Okay, so I'll start with the over-under, Huss. I'll set it at 65 for Connor Hellebuyck and give me the over. With one little disclaimer, and I do wonder how much this is going to factor in this year. Connor Hellebuyck is probably going to be the starting goalie for the U.S. team at the Winter Olympics. That's not an easy assignment in the middle of a season, right? To go over to Beijing. So while the rest of the league kind of gets their rest, guys that aren't going to be playing at the Olympics, Connor Hellebuck's probably going to be playing some really, really high stakes hockey in the middle of a season. And so I do wonder, does that factor into his usage? Because the last thing you want is Connor Hellebuyck running out of gas in late March, early April, right? That would be the worst case scenario. And I suppose to a degree, the play of Eric Comrie will factor into how much gas they can leave in the tank for Connor Hellebuyck. Paul Maurice, we asked him last week about Eric Comrie. I asked him flat out, are you confident that Eric Comrie can be a backup NHL goaltender? And Paul Maurice said, absolutely. This is a guy, he's beloved in the room, and there's no question about it. Guys love to rally and for Eric Comrie. And I suspect we're going to see the Jets do everything they can when he's in net to try and make his life as easy as possible. That said, this is a performance-based business, right? You don't get ahead by being well-liked in the room. You got to perform. And the backup goalie position is a difficult one at the best of times in the NHL. And it's even more difficult when you're playing behind a perennial Vezina Trophy finalist, and especially on a team that is expected to go places. Eric Comrie has the job by default, basically out of camp. But there's no question, Huss, that there's going to be some early pressure when he gets in for his first games to perform. And that pressure could really be ramped up, for example, if the Birdman gets in some exhibition action and then goes down to the Moose and is playing, lights out hockey early in the year. And I suppose there would be pressure potentially to look outside the organization for a more veteran option. And we know there are goaltenders right now, guys with NHL pedigree as backups and whatnot, that don't have hockey homes right now, probably just waiting on opportunities. So yeah, there's going to be pressure on Eric Comrie. Because in a league where the line between success and failure is often very thin, you can't afford, whether it's 15 or 18 games that Comrie plays, you can't just afford to sort of throw those games away and say, well, we'll get enough in the other games to kind of get us through. You're going to need Eric Comrie to play some really good hockey, and we'll see if he's up to the task.
Mike McIntyre with us. Hey, Mike, you mentioned Beijing, and we know that Connor Hellebuyck's going to be there. But before we go, I wanted to ask you, what do you think the chances of Blake Wheeler playing in Beijing? I mean, I was thinking it was sort of maybe more a 50-50 chance, assuming that he is committed and wants to do it. I mean, he's already been there. He may think that time off might really help him for the second half, and I can't speak for him. But assuming that he wants to go, I've seen him on more than of the USA team list that we've seen put up by people following it south of the border. He's on more of them that he's not on. Yeah. And of course, Mark Scheifele, in his situation, battling for one of the spots on Team Canada. How extra motivated do you think Mark Scheifele is going to be in these first 3-4 months of the season to show that he belongs with McDavid and McKinnon and all the top Canadian stars on what could be his best chance ever to represent Canada, to win a gold medal right in the prime of his career? Yeah,
to me, I mean, I don't buy. I know some think Mark Scheifele's position on Team Canada is in peril. I think Mark Scheifele's on Team Canada. Now, is he a top 3 center on Team Canada? Probably not. He may have to play the wing. There's going to be a lot of really good centers that are going to have to take on a bit of a different role to play for Team Canada. I think Mark Scheifele's there, but for sure, I don't think he's coming into the season just assuming he's a shoo-in. So it will add an extra bit of motivation for him. As for Blake Wheeler, that's a real interesting one to me. And if I'm the American brass, like I'm looking at Blake Wheeler thinking, we could have him on our team. He's not going to be playing on our top 2 lines, 5-on-5. They could use him as a 4th line right winger on a deep American team, but they could also use him as a guy on the power play, right? Everybody knows what Blake Wheeler can do and his ability to find guys in traffic and feather those passes in. That skill hasn't eroded one bit. Yeah, he's a little bit slower than maybe he was a couple years ago. And there's certain things with age and time that obviously catch up to you. His hands, his vision is still top notch. And you look at the kind of guys on the US team that, he could potentially be feeding on the top power play unit there and then playing, a lesser role 5-on-5. That's got to be enticing for sure. And, we know there's not going to be just like a training camp to figure out who's on these Olympic teams. It's going to be based on, pedigree and past performance and current performance for sure. So I think Blake Wheeler is very much on the radar. And, the Jets would love, obviously, him to get off to a good start to this season because it would benefit them. It would also probably benefit Blake Wheeler and his chances for going to Beijing.
If you pump truth serum into Paul Maurice and Kevin Cheveldayoff and said that, hey, it's up to you guys if your captain goes to the Olympics, you think they'd rather have him take a month off?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for sure. And, I haven't crunched the numbers in looking at the Jets versus other teams, but, we know Nikolai Ehlers is going over there for Denmark. Kyle Connor should be a shoo-in to be on the American team. We mentioned Scheifele. We mentioned Hellebuyck. Like, if you lose 5 of your best players, like let's say Wheeler does go, now you've got Wheeler, Scheifele, Ehlers, Connor, Hellebuyck. To lose those guys and to have them go, I mean, it's great for them. It's great for hockey on an international map. You're right, though. I mean, are there going to be a lot of other teams losing 5 top players? And what could that mean down the road? It's yet another storyline to sort of follow as we get going here.
Mike, this is great. I really enjoyed the piece today in the Winnipeg Free Press. If you haven't seen it already, the title is Jets Brass Breathing Easier Right Now. I can tell you that, being in this program and seeing the chat every day, I think you could say the same thing about the fan base after Kevin Cheveldayoff's big summer. But the expectations are high, excitement levels are high, and Man, we're going to have asses in seats on Sunday night at Canada Life Center for the first time in, 20 months or something like that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Winnipeg, the Bombers were the first to host sort of an outdoor mass gathering, sports related, right? I think the Bombers CFL season opener was the biggest gathering since the pandemic began outdoors for a sporting event. And I haven't looked to see if anybody's playing a home game before the Jets this Sunday, but we know a lot of Canadian teams are still not at 100% capacity. The Jets will be. And so I don't know if I'm going on a limb here to suggest that this Sunday, this may be the biggest indoor sports gathering since the pandemic began. And once again, Winnipeg will be front and center. And yeah, I can't wait to get into the rink, which, by the way, is called Canada Life Center, folks. It's no longer Bell MTS Place.
Not familiar with that old sponsor. Not familiar with who you're talking about.
It should be a great atmosphere. And it'll make it, probably not just your typical sleepy preseason affair. There should be a buzz in the rink that we haven't seen for quite some time. I can't wait.
No doubt. Hey, before we go, what else do you have cooking up in the pages of the Winnipeg Free Press as we dive into training camp on Thursday?
Yeah, so Jay Bell, my colleague, and I will have an extensive preview running in Thursday's edition of the paper, kind of teeing up all the big storylines and questions and battles. And I don't want to give away too much, but this Saturday, Huss, I got a piece that I'm really excited about. It's a deeper dive, a longer read that's Jets related, and it ties into sort of the excitement around the team and training camp. I've done a ton of interviews and got some writing to finish up on it this week. So I won't spoil my own story too much. Just say if you're a fan of the Jets, you'll want to keep an eye on the Saturday Free Press for a bigger feature from yours truly.
Hey, one last thing. I did see that tweet that you put out yesterday at that virtual town hall tomorrow at noon. You guys are putting it on. Steve Lyons, the sports editor, is going to be there. Janet McMahon from Sports Manitoba. She's, of course, the CEO. And Wade Miller. Tell us about that. I'm not sure. I know there was an RSVP, but I'm sure there's some people here in the chat that might be interested to check that out.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that, Huss. It's a free event. It's a 1 hour kind of virtual town hall. I tweeted the link out yesterday, and you just got to go grab your free ticket. So it's from noon to 1 tomorrow, Wednesday, and we're taking questions from participants. We're going to talk about things like, the Bombers bringing fans back in and the Jets welcoming fans. It's sort of looking... we're going to talk minor sports as well, like hockey tryouts are happening across the province right now. So Janet McMahon will be able to talk a bit about that. And just kind of the whole idea of getting back to a sense of normalcy. It's part of a series the Free Press has been doing. So this week, we're looking at it from a sports perspective. And yeah, a couple great guests Steve Lyons and I will be chatting with. And folks, if you've got your lunch hour free tomorrow, go grab that free ticket and we'll see you online.
Great stuff, Mike. Thanks for doing this. We'll see you at the rink very soon, and always love having you on Winnipeg Sports Talk. People loving your appearance, and they're as fired up as we all are to get going with this training camp and this upcoming season.
Awesome. Thanks, folks. Take care.
Right on. There he is, Mike McIntyre. Give him a follow on Twitter, and, of course, check out all of his work covering the Jets at winnipegfreepress.com and in the pages of the Winnipeg Free Press.